Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Sandy Quinn, a member of the board of directors of the Richard Nixon Foundation. We're speaking to you live from the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. We're appearing in the magnificent East Room, which is a reproduction of the largest room in the White House, frequently called America's Grand Ballroom. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for watching. Tonight's a great night because we've got a very special treat for you. We have someone who spent a number of years at Richard Nixon's side. And remember that when he lost the two elections, the presidential in 1962, the gubernatorial in 60, and the gubernatorial in 1962, people wrote him off. They said, Richard Nixon is gone. He said, this is my last press conference. Not so. At about the same time, a young man left Columbia University, graduated from Columbia, joined the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, became an editorial writer, and along the way he met Richard Nixon. And that began a magnificent journey. It began a magic carpet ride from Richard Nixon's defeat through years of what Richard Nixon described as the wilderness years to the achievement of the highest office in the world, President of the United States. And Pat Buchanan was with him every step of the way. And it's recorded in this great book that was just launched last week. In fact, this is the Pacific Coast launch of it, The Greatest Comeback, of how Richard Nixon built the new majority and the silent majority and how he won the presidency. So here's a man who spent every day with him, strategizing, planning, creating, and he's a first-hand eyewitness to the magnificent brilliance of the 37th president. Please welcome Pat Buchanan.
Thank you very much, Sandy. With that reception, I may start looking at 2016. You know, I always relish coming back here. This is the second time, I guess, I've spoken in the East Room of the Nixon Library, and it is a magnificent and memorable place. You know, I was going to mention all the folks I've served with over the years, or even going back 4 and 5 decades, and I'd like to single out one who was with Richard Nixon for the campaign of 1960 before I was there, the campaign for governor in 62 before I was there, and who rode with Richard Nixon on that plane around trying to save Barry Goldwater in 1964 before I was there, and that's Shelley Buchanan. You want to stand up, Shelley? She was Shelley Scarney then, as I recall. I'd also like to say a couple of words about Sandy Quinn, who I got to know Richard Nixon up in New York when I first went to work for him. Told me, Pat, when you get to Washington, there's 3 people you want to see, and Sandy Quinn, Bill Stover, and Agnes Waldron, who had been old friends and loyalists of a long time. And Sandy has done a magnificent job for the foundation and everything, and I know you heard him tonight, and I really think he deserves more than one round of applause. You know, and the greatest comeback is not definitive history, of that period. But what it is a memoir of my time and those 3 years with Richard Nixon before he became president. And it is the story of a man who rose from one of the worst defeats in American political history and the worst occasions, and came back from basically a broken career to lead a shattered and ruined party, not only to victory in 1968, but to create a great coalition that succeeded FDR's coalition and dominated the presidency for 20 of the next 24 years. I've often told friends that what Richard Nixon did in the 20th century is matched only by one other man, that's FDR, who created that coalition which dominated the White House, I guess if you exclude Eisenhower, for 7 of 9 presidencies after 1932. Let me tell you a little bit then and go back and try to tell some of this story as much as I can do in the limited time we have available. The first words I heard from the President of the United States were these: "Buchanan, was that you throwing the eggs?" He had just been inaugurated, delivered his inaugural speech, was coming up Pennsylvania Avenue, and his limousine was showered with debris and rocks and eggs and everything, and he showed up at the White House, and he was going into the reviewing stand, and Shelley and I were walking into the reviewing stand along these boards that the Secret Service had put down because it was so muddy. And I heard behind me the Secret Service saying, "Could you step off the board, sir?" So I stepped off the boards, and in walks the President of the United States, and that's what he said: "Buchanan, was that you throwing the eggs?" But let me go back, really, and that incident, incidentally, is a metaphor for the city Richard Nixon came into. He was the first president since Zachary Taylor to take over the White House with both houses of the Congress in opposition. The media either loathed or detested Richard Nixon by and large. The bureaucracy had been built up in the New Deal, the Fair Deal, and the Great Society, and was overwhelmingly Democratic. It was a hostile city that Richard Nixon came into that had just broken the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who, after winning a magnificent landslide in '64, had stood down in 1968. That was the America, basically, of madmen, if you will. The America that we saw on that film, Mad Men. Take a look at what happened in those years before I got to meet Richard Nixon. 1963, we had John F. Kennedy assassinated. In 1964, you had the first uprising at Berkeley of the great campus disorders of the 1960s. This was the beginning, if you will, of the revolution. In 1965, folks out here will remember the Watts riot, the worst race riot of its time since the Civil War. You had the beginning of the revolution. You know, I was a young man. I was an editorial writer at the Globe Democrat in St. Louis. I drove back to Washington to hear Martin Luther King deliver his famous speech in the Lincoln Memorial. I was up in the memorial with him. It was a magnificent moment. 1 year later, 50 years ago this month, I was in Neshoba County, Mississippi, before they found the bodies of the 3 civil rights workers. And the civil rights revolution of those days, which had started off so well, was rapidly disintegrating into disorder and riots and Black Power and Black Panthers and all the rest of it. That was a world we came into. Now let's take a look at what Nixon himself was in that period. You know, people talk about 62 and 64, and they're correct. But you go all the way back to 1950. That was the last election that Richard Nixon won in his own right. He won a landslide, the biggest victory California had ever seen, over Helen Gahagan Douglas. When he won with Eisenhower, but Eisenhower could have been elected on any ticket. But 1954, when Nixon was leading the Republican Party lost both houses of Congress. They lost 13 Senate seats in 1958. 1960, he lost narrowly in a contested election, maybe a stolen election, to Jack Kennedy. We know what happened. We all heard of what happened in Chicago and in Texas. 62, he came out and ran for governor and was defeated by Governor Pat Brown. Then he had that famous press conference where he just said, this is it. He'd had it with the press. He said, think of all the fun you're going to be missing. You won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, folks, this is my last press conference. He was finished, down and out. But then in 64, even though he was out of it, he not only introduced Barry Goldwater at that convention, Richard Nixon went and campaigned all across America for Barry Goldwater, harder than Barry campaigned for himself. But look at where he was and where the party was in 1965 when I arrived. The Republicans had 140 seats in the House, 32 in the Senate, outnumbered more than 2-to-1 in both bodies. They had 17 governorships, outnumbered 2-to-1 in governorships. State legislators, they were outnumbered 2-to-1. People were talking about the Republican Party as the party that had lost its head, that is finished. It was split between the Goldwater wing and the Rockefeller-Romney wing. And that's what Richard Nixon inherited. That's when he began to come back, his great comeback. So that's the situation I encountered, frankly, when I joined Richard Nixon. Now, how did I get aboard with Richard Nixon? Well, I was an editorial writer at the conservative St. Louis Globe-Democrat, and having some difficulty with my publisher at the time. And I thought maybe I ought to get out of this office and get into the real world. So Nixon was invited by Dirksen to come fill in for him at a speech in Belleville, Illinois, right across the river, about 15 miles across the river from St. Louis. So he was going to speak there, and then he was going to go to a cocktail reception given by Don Hess, who was the cartoonist at the Globe-Democrat and a good friend of mine. So I said, Don, what you got to do is you got to get me invited to your party, then you got to get me to meet Richard Nixon at your party because I want to meet him. He said, I'll do it for you. So I went over and waited till Nixon's speech was over and got in a motorcade behind his and went over to Hess's house and got him, and he got me into the kitchen, introduced me to Richard Nixon. And I said, Mr. Vice President, how are you? If you're going to run in 1968, I'd like to get aboard early. It was direct. I figured the direct approach was best. Don't beat around the bush, you know. And he said, what do you do? I said, well, I'm the assistant editorial editor of the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. And he said, I don't want to know what your title is. I want to know what you do. And so I said, I write editorials, and since we're a paper, we got 2 editorial writers, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch has 8, I write on everything. I write on local politics, statewide, county politics, national tax policy, foreign policy. I write on everything. And so he seemed pretty impressed, and just to convince him that I was not, putting him on a bit, I said, we've met before. And he said, what? I said, we've met before, sir. You see, I was a caddy at the Burning Tree Country Club when I was 14 years old. I was on the caddy log. We were the last men on the bench, Pete Cook and I. We frankly integrated the caddy bench at the Burning Tree Country Club. There were all black folk kids out there who were unhappy. We were horning in on what they had. But anyhow, we never got bags, and the black kids would go out in the morning and they'd go out in the afternoon. So we're waiting in the late afternoon, and out comes this plaid golf bag. And I said, that's the vice president's bag. And sure enough, the pro came out and he looked over at the bench, and the 2 of us were the only ones sitting there. So he says, come on over. And so we went around with the Vice President of the United States for 18 holes, 4 hours. And to convince Nixon I wasn't making this all up, I gave him the name of the pro and the assistant pro at Burning Tree. And so this morning, after this meeting with Nixon, he's driving out to Lambert Field for an hour, and the cartoonist comes in and said, Pat, Nixon talked about you all the way out to Lambert Air Force. I said, that's a good sign. So So then I didn't hear anything from him. So about 2 weeks later, I get this phone call, and it's the familiar voice. Can you come to New York and continue our conversation? So I said, sure. And so I went to New York, and for 3 hours in Richard Nixon's office, he quizzed me on everything I could think of: foreign policy, domestic policy, tax policy, Congress. It was exhausting for 3 hours. And when we were done, he said, I'd like to hire you for 1 year. I said, 1 year? He said, yeah, because if we don't pick up seats in 1966, the nomination not going to be worth anything in 1968. So I said, then he offered me a salary which was 50% higher than what I was making. So I said, yeah, I'm interested in this. So I said, I'll take it, but you better call my publisher first because he doesn't know I'm here. So that's how I got aboard Richard Milhouse Nixon in 1965. Now, when I got with him, the first thing he said, my 3 assignments were, you're going to help write a column for me, you're going to get rid of all this stack of mail this high, and travel with me in 1966 or work with me in the 66 campaign. And I said, fine, but I had larger dreams of what my functions would be. And I said, the first thing we got to do, Mr. Vice President, if we're going to win that nomination, I said, you've got the center of the Republican Party. They've admired you, respected you, those wonderful folks in California, Indiana, Nebraska. They're still with you. But I said, I'm a member of the Goldwater movement. I was a Goldwater man. I said, if we can put together the Goldwater movement with the Nixon center of the Republican Party, there is nobody that can stop you from getting that nomination. Rockefeller's too far out on the left. They're all too far out on the left. And so I began, first thing I did, he had a breach. Mr. Nixon said something about Bill Buckley and the Buckleyites being more dangerous than the Birchers. I said, we're going to have to clear this up. And so I wrote this letter explaining what Mr. Nixon had meant to the publisher of National Review and Bill Buckley. And we healed that breach. And then with my friend Tom Charles Houston, who sort of came aboard, we started holding meetings all during '66 with leaders of various conservative groups Nixon hadn't met, and I certainly hadn't met. I was a journalist, but Houston knew who all they were. So we met with them, and then we started inviting every columnist who was a conservative to come up and meet Richard Nixon and have an interview with him and give him time. And so we kept building this alliance with Richard Nixon and the conservative movement, the center of the Republican Party and the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Then Nixon, his own idea, went out on his own in 1966 and campaigned in 35 states, 80 congressional districts, every single Republican who asked for him. He went in all 11 southern states, went all over the country, working for the Republican Party. And it was a move that it was, I said it in my book, it was in Nixon's interest to do this, but it was also consistent with what he believed. Nixon was a fighter. His party was in trouble, and he loved his party. He was loyal to it, so he went out. We're going to fight in every district we can. So, and I traveled with him that whole time. And he was a Spartan. I've never seen anybody work harder than that. There was occasional incidents, like let me tell you one. We had some trouble, of course. Mr. Nixon had some trouble with the Rockefellers. Let me tell you one story from the campaign of '66. We were in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And Nixon got up and he had a press conference and did an event for John Paul Hammerschmidt, who was the one guy that beat Bill Clinton for Congress. Or Bill Clinton, I think Bill Clinton, no, it was his first race, I think he beat Bill Clinton. But anyhow, we're in Fort Smith, and so Nixon goes to the motel, and it's a rectangular thing. And it's on the inside, but it's only one story. And so Nixon's got this room here, and he says, I do not want to be disturbed. I've got a nap. I've got a big speech tonight. I don't want anybody to disturb me. And I said, you got it. And I went down, moseyed around my own room, and I saw this huge fellow marching straight across the quadrangle of this motel straight toward Nixon's door. And he was yelling, hey, Dick, to Mr. Nixon, who was sleeping. So I started running, and I didn't get there in time, and this guy is pounding on the door, and the door opens, and Richard Nixon let him in. I thought, that's the end of Pat Buchanan. And Nixon says, Pat, have you met Win Rockefeller? This was Winthrop Rockefeller, the brother of Nelson and David Rockefeller, but he was a great war hero. He was the youngest of the brothers. He'd been involved in some scandal, Bobo Rockefeller in the 50s I'd been reading about, but a great fellow. And that was my first introduction to the Rockefellers in that campaign. And the second was, and you may know the name, Pat Hillings, was a congressman out here. And Hillings traveled with us. And we got to Oregon during this campaign, and Hillings comes up to me, and of course I was a Goldwater man, and my views of Nelson Rockefeller, it's hard to describe how harsh they were. So Hillings comes up to me and says, hey, Pat, the old man's going to endorse Rockefeller. I said, what? And so I took off down the hall. I get to Nixon's suite. I open the door and go in. He's not there. So I hear something, so I go over and open the door to the bathroom. He's about to get into the shower. And I said, you're not going to endorse that blankety blank, are you? And he said, don't worry, Pat, we'll get something for it. So sure enough, what Richard Nixon did, again, this tells you something about the man. He'd been treated brutally by the people in New York. They treated him like dirt. They invited him to nothing. When he moved to New York, he's in law practice. They didn't invite him to any Republican events or anything. And here he is going up to endorse Nelson Rockefeller, which he did. Why? Because he said, first, the party's got to win, and we're all going to have to diminish our egos a bit. We're all going to have to come together. We've been deeply divided, Goldwater and Rockefeller. And this is the right thing to do. And the right thing to do, once again, was also the right thing to do for Richard Nixon. So he endorsed Rocky. And then at the end of the campaign, Richard Nixon, I went, I was we were in Oregon, and we heard word that Lyndon Johnson was coming back from the Manila Summit, the summit meeting, 1966, October. And he was going to campaign in all of these states, in a dozen states. And I mistakenly went in and told Nixon before he went out for a speech that night. I said, the president's coming back, he's going to campaign in a dozen states. And so Nixon said, well, we'll just have to see about that. But he was clearly shaken. And he went out that night and he endorsed Tom McCall, the governor, running for governor of Oregon, except he kept calling him Bob McCall. Until the audience finally said, it's Tom, it's Tom. So that's a lesson if you're in politics. Do not give your candidate bad news before he's about to go make a speech. But I will say this, so Nixon came back and he was very down. He said if Johnson comes back, we could be cut from 40 seats, which he'd been predicted, to maybe winning 12 seats. And so he was down, and so I went back to my room, and about midnight he called me in. And he said, take some notes. And he dictated a speech on Vietnam, right on through. I must have taken 12 pages of notes. And he says, now, you get out in the morning and you fly to Boise, Idaho, and you work on this speech and prepare it for me. I'm going to go campaign in the state of Washington for about all day long, and the next morning after that, I'm going to come down to Boise. And we worked on that and worked on it and worked on it as we flew around the country. And just before the election, Nixon dropped it in the New York Times, an appraisal of the Manila communique by Johnson. Johnson got up at a press conference. You can take a look at the date, November 4th, 1966, critical moment in the comeback of Richard Nixon. It was on the front page of the New York Times. And from Lyndon Johnson's tapes, he called Hubert Humphrey and said, did you see what that SOB said about us in the New York Times this morning? And then Johnson went out in a press conference and just lambasted Richard Nixon as badly as any president has ever attacked a leader of the opposition party. And those aren't my words. Those are the words of Jules Whitcover, who wrote a book about the event. And Nixon, we flew up to Waterville, Maine. Mike Wallace, who had been at the airport, I was reporting to Nixon on what I had heard. I was on the plane listening on radio, and Nixon came out to the plane, and I said, you're not going to believe what the president is saying about us. And so we flew up there, and Mike Wallace, who was at the airport, flew after us and caught Nixon in Waterville, Maine. And Nixon came out and handled it beautifully. He was gracious to Johnson and said, look, President's had a hard-working man, hardest working president I've seen. He's a little tired from his trip. I understand this. We got questions on Vietnam that need to be answered. And the whole country, the media, astoundingly said Richard Nixon is saying exactly the right thing. So all of a sudden, end of 1966, Richard Nixon is vaulted up into contention by Lyndon Johnson for the Republican nomination. However, 66 election win, we won. Big time, 47 House seats, 3 Senate seats, 8 new governors. So we get to the weekend after that, our celebration at the Drake Hotel. Richard Nixon took us to the restaurant out with the wife and everything. We had a great time. Time and Newsweek come out after the election. Who's on the cover? 6 Republicans, the new Republican leaders. Governor Reagan, Governor Rockefeller, Governor Romney, Senator Percy, Senator Brooke, and Senator Hatfield, and no Richard Nixon. And it was a real downer for us that he had been left out after all the work he had done. But I'll tell you, they did us a favor. They did us a favor by leaving us out of the news and vaulting everybody else up. And just before that election day, Nixon himself told the national press, he was on one of those Sunday programs, that after this election is over, I'm going to take a 6-month moratorium from politics completely. And I saw Nixon a day or so later. I said, sir, is this wise? I mean, Governor George Romney of Michigan, is ahead of Lyndon Johnson by 8 points in the national polls. He's running far away first for the Republican nomination, and we're going to drop out for 6 months and do nothing? And Nixon said in his own manner, Pat, let them chew on him for a little while. And I gather he meant the press corps. And if you read my book, that is exactly what the press did. But you know, in fairness, I put a line in my book about Mitt Romney, how tough it must have been when he was 20 years old in Paris, seeing what happened to his father's launch for the presidency, because I've never seen, it was not an outstanding performance. I mean, Romney went out and he got caught up on the Vietnam issue, and the press went after him, and one after another attacks from the press. It was one of the worst things I've ever seen. I told Nixon one time, I sent in this editorial. I said, I've never seen anything this vicious by this fellow Tully. He said, well, you should see what Tully writes about me, Pat. And so, but it was just terrible. And Murray Kempton, who was a great writer, New York Post, I was an admirer of his from journalism school. Everybody remembers that George Romney was at American Motors. It was a huge success. He brought out the early Nash Rambler. It was just a tremendous success. And that's one of the things that vaulted his career. And Kempton and I slipped into the meeting myself. Romney was speaking in New York at one of these large Jewish community gatherings, a huge thing down at the Waldorf, I believe. And I saw Murray Kempton over there, and I wanted to see what he said the next morning in his paper. And he had listened to Romney speak, and his conclusion was, he said, first line, the Nash Rambler must have been a hell of a car if George Romney was able to sell it. I mean, that was typical of what was being written about Romney. And I mean, you almost feel badly for the guy, except we were benefiting from all this. So, but then we really got into the later 60s here. We're in 1967. And anybody can remember, people might remember the places, but Newark and Detroit. We've seen what happens to Detroit as a consequence. Newark and Detroit went up in horrible race riots. They had federal troops in both of the cities. They had many, many dead, thousands and thousands arrested, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage. And this showed that this was part of what was happening in that decade for which we were not responsible, but There's no doubt about it, we benefited from this. The revolution was on in America. Social, cultural, moral. I mean, the campuses were ablaze. The anti-war movement was rising then. It had not been rising in '65, but by now it was ablaze. You had the civil rights movement, as I mentioned, was degenerating in many cases into riots and black power and all the rest of it. And so all of these things caused more and more Americans to say, you know, the Great Society, we supported this, we supported civil rights, but it's not turning out well. It's not turning out well. And something is terribly wrong with our country. This is what Middle America was saying. And then Romney, Governor Romney, in his famous statement on Lou Gordon's TV show, I believe it was in late August, he got on and he made a terrible mistake, or maybe it was what he believed, but he said, I was all wrong on Vietnam. We should never have gotten in there. When I went over to Vietnam in 1965, I got the greatest brainwashing you've ever seen. And I was brainwashed by the American military and the American diplomats. And after 4 days, finally the New York Times picked up on it. Romney says he's been brainwashed. It was not a good thing for his candidacy. And Eugene Mccarthy, who became a friend of mine, was brutal on Governor Romney. He said in Romney's case, a full brainwashing was not needed. That a light rinse would have sufficed. But you have to, this is brutal, but you have to remember in those days, that is how tough Governor George Romney had it in those days, to the point where we're running against him and I'm feeling sorry for the guy. So then we come up to 1968, which was a real year of tragedy. Well, it was a year of real tragedy, the most divisive year, I believe, in American political history since the Civil War. My friend Tom Brokaw wrote a book called Boom about it, and other books have been written about it. I've got them now, 64, 65, 66. You almost had to go through that era to experience that. We began the campaign, and Dwight Chapin is here tonight, Dwight Chapin and I and Ray Price, and I think that was it, just the three of us, flew in a small plane out of LaGuardia, February 1st, 1968, into Logan, and then we took a car. Nick Ruey was the advance man, took Nixon up to Nashua, New Hampshire, where we got him into a room under a phony name, Benjamin Chapman. He was going to go into dramatic move into Manchester the next day and sign up for the primary. And I remember when we were going down the hall in this motel, Benjamin Chapman, of course, Richard Nixon in his hat, was going down the hall, and this inebriated fellow was walking toward him. And he's walking toward him, and he kept looking at him, and he passed by, and you could see there was some recognition on his face, but not a great deal. But that's how we got Nixon into New Hampshire. But that very day was the first day of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. And I was concerned because my little brother was with the 101st Airborne in Vietnam, had just gone over. But in that month, the Tet Offensive dominated the news. You got to take a look at the New York Times. There's a picture of Richard Nixon he announced. And he got one column in the New York Times. It had 8 columns in those days. And the 4-column photograph was of the Saigon police chief shooting that fella in the head in the street of Saigon, the terrorist who had come in and was murdering people. But the Saigon police chief holding that as Eddie Adams' photo won the Pulitzer Prize. But that's the beginning of that year. Within February also, you had the massacre at Hue. 3,000 were killed. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese walked through town with lists, murdering everyone loyal to the Saigon government or working with the Americans. And before February was out, Governor Romney quit the race, dropped out. Again, I was with Dwight Chapin. I got a call from a friend of mine who had gone to journalism school with, and he was covering Romney, and he said, Romney's dropping out this afternoon. So Nixon was speaking at what we call the Little Towns Tour, and he came down from the podium, so I grabbed him, and we took him into the men's room, And Dwight and I said, Romney is going to drop out this afternoon. I've got it on good authority from my buddy at journalism school who's covering him. So Nixon walks out, and Mike Wallace said, what do you have to say about Governor Romney dropping out of the race? And I will say, Mr. Nixon, he carried it pretty well. He said, that's the first I've heard of that. Sometimes you would just stop cold. So anyhow, that Romney was gone from the race. But what happened then, 2 weeks later, they had the New Hampshire primary. And Richard Nixon, well, he won. He got over 70% of the vote. Of course, we didn't have opponent then. But people, you looked at the total votes were out. You had Nixon, you had write-ins for Rockefeller, and you had Romney, still people voting for him. You had Bobby Kennedy write-ins on the Democratic side. Eugene McCarthy and Lyndon Johnson was a write-in. Nixon got more votes, people weren't looking at it, than all the others put together. Because of a little project we had, he got 4 times as many write-in votes on the Democratic ballot as Bobby Kennedy. And people didn't notice. They should have looked closely at that, because what that said is that, look, that the country's turning toward this party and somewhat toward this man who's supposed to be the greatest loser of all time. The big news, though, was Eugene McCarthy, who got 42% of the vote against Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States. And Johnson, his people, I don't know what they're thinking of. Johnson's name, people don't remember it, Johnson's name wasn't even on the ballot. The President of the United States was running as a write-in candidate in New Hampshire. And so I was astonished that he did this, and half of McCarthy's votes were from hawks, people who wanted Johnson to be tougher on Vietnam. So Johnson's people handled it horribly. 3 or 4 days later, Robert Kennedy jumped into the race against Johnson and began to savage him. As he said, Johnson is appealing to the darker impulses of the American spirit. It was just brutal stuff, and he jumped in, and Murray Kempton again, who had loved Bobby Kennedy, called him a complete opportunist who comes down from the hills to shoot the wounded, and it was just a brutal attack. And so then, Rockefeller didn't, we expected Rockefeller to come in and go after us because Romney was gone. So Rockefeller did not get, he holds a press conference, and again, Dwight and I are in Mr. Nixon, he had a habit. He didn't watch television. He would ask me to watch it, or Dwight and I to watch it, and then come in and tell him what our impressions were. No, it's a very smart thing to do, I think, because he wants to know what other folks from different viewpoints are thinking about what they see. He knows what he thinks. And so Rockefeller did not announce, or announced he wasn't going to run. He said, no desire to be president, and I hope you all take this seriously and everything. So we went in and told Richard Nixon. And for years they asked me what Nixon said, and I didn't tell them. What Nixon said was, it's the girl. At that time, Drew Pearson had put out these reports through his newsletter that Nelson Rockefeller had a girlfriend. And after the marriage his initial marriage broke up, this would have just killed him. And so that rumor was floating all over the place, so we thought that was the reason he didn't announce he's not going to run. So that didn't turn out to be true. So then, that's March. We're still in March. That's around the 21st. On the last day of March, we were going to give a speech on Vietnam, which I was very opposed to. And we had to cancel it because Johnson announced he's going to speak on March 31st. We were going to speak on the 30th. And so Nixon told me, go out to the airport, get in the limousine, and stay at the airport. I'm going to go to Wisconsin, which is the primary was on the 2nd of April, and get on the runway. And when my plane comes in, I want you to get on the plane, run down, get on the plane ahead of the press, tell me what Johnson says, so I'll be able to respond. So I said, sure. And so I was in the limousine with this black driver who was Nixon's driver, and we're sitting there in that limousine, and here comes Johnson is talking away about Vietnam. He's the bombing halts and things like that. We knew were going to come, or we thought were going to come. And then he says, I will not accept, seek, nor will I accept the nomination of my party for another term. Lyndon Johnson was basically saying he wasn't going to run again. It was a whole new ball game. So I told the driver, move this car down the tarmac and get me right next to that plane before the press gets on there, because he doesn't know, the president or vice president doesn't know what's happening. So I got on and ran in there to the plane and told him what was happening, and Nixon walks out and says, I guess it's the year of the dropout, and he admitted in his memoirs that he should not have said that. But what could you think? Romney drops out, Rockefeller drops out, Johnson drops out all in 1 month. They're gone, and it's a brand new picture. But the new picture meant that I thought we were in trouble, because I thought we could beat Johnson. Country desperately wanted change. I thought we could beat Johnson. I thought we could beat Bobby Kennedy. I always did, because he was on the left wing of the Democratic Party. He was savaging the president constantly. And if we'd got the nomination, Lyndon Johnson would have been working for Richard Nixon rather than Bobby Kennedy. But Hubert Humphrey was a different story. Humphrey was a committed liberal, Democratic liberal, who was in tight with the Democratic establishment as vice president. So I said we could have a real problem here beating Hubert Humphrey, who I think is their strongest candidate. So that's March 31st. 4 days later, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. 100 American cities went up in flames and smoke and fire and violence and looting and burning, and there were federal troops in my hometown of Washington, D.C. Places I'd grown up and I was very familiar with as a kid were being burned down. It was the worst series of racial violence in American history, 100 cities burning, and it was horrendous. And that tremendously influenced the politics that year. The American people came to see, were beginning to say this country is coming apart. And over in Baltimore, which burned badly, Stokely Carmichael, the racial incendiary who eventually became a communist and went to Ghana, or Guinea, he was down there encouraging all this burning and looting. And a governor named Spiro T. Agnew called in the civil rights leaders and read them all the riot act for not condemning the racial incendiaries. He said, I condemn all these white racists, but now you got to condemn these guys that are burning down our city. And it was a very tough thing, and Agnew was known as a liberal governor. He'd been a Rockefeller man. But he did a tremendous job, and I had notes of all this and clippings, and I sent those to Nixon because I was very impressed with what Agnew was doing. And Nixon was equally impressed, as we would find out later. And then my alma mater, Columbia University, before April was out, exploded in the worst violence of any campus of the 1960s. Mark Rudd, you hear about it now. They took over the campus. They took over the dean's office. They trashed the dean's office, and it took a week. They finally called the New York NYPD in to clear the campus. There were black radicals and white radicals both. And Nixon, I will say, and there was a division inside the Nixon camp. I was in the Goldwater Conservative, and our research writing group was very conservative, the most conservative element in the whole Nixon campaign, but we had liberals in there too. We were deeply divided over how we should deal with that, and sort of Nixon was going along with my proposal, which is the American people want to crack down on the nonsense. They've supported the civil rights, they supported all these initiatives of the Great Society, and they see this happen, and now they say laws got to be enforced. There was a poll taken that found only 2% of the people in Oregon, where we were campaigning, agree with the students on the campus who are demonstrating, agree that they have a just cause and what they're doing is the right thing. So we had the country, the future silent majority, was being formed right there in 1968 in April. So then we moved to May. In May, Richard Nixon was in the Oregon primary. It was the last of the contested primaries. He had no opposition. And so he wiped up the floor with everybody. He got 70%. Reagan, who'd had a film running up there, got 22%. Rockefeller, 4% for Nelson, Rockefeller. And I remember Shelley and I were at the Oregon primary that night. Nixon won. He went down to dinner at the Benson with Pat Nixon. He had a dinner. And so I went off because first time in history, Kennedy had lost an election. Bobby Kennedy was beaten by Eugene McCarthy in the Oregon primary. And so I said, I've got to see this because Bobby Kennedy was coming up from California where he was campaigning to the Benson Hotel to concede defeat. And so Shelley and I went down, and just as he got out of the car, I could see Teddy White with him and Freckles, he had his dog with him. And I went to the room just like this, where he was standing up like here, conceding defeat. And I will say, I was not a fan of Bobby Kennedy. It was the most gracious concession speech, or one of them I'd ever heard. I said, this is really a class act. And he had handled it extremely well, Bobby Kennedy did. He said, Gene McCarthy's run a fine race. We're defeated here, but there's going to be another race down in California in a week, the California primary, and we'll meet Senator McCarthy down there, and we congratulate him. It was just a lovely speech. And that was over, and we went back to New York, and 1 week after that night, I got a call from Jeff Bell from our campaign headquarters. At 3 in the morning, woke me up at my apartment, and he said simply, Bobby Kennedy's been shot. And so I called Mr. Nixon, and he was already awakened. Julie and I think David were watching returns over there at the time, and they had apparently seen the news stories. And it was that kind of year. And so Nixon went to the funeral, but then we had a battle inside the Nixon campaign, basically, over a real issue, which was, which way do we go? How do we defense against Governor George Wallace? Let me go back a bit. A benefit Nixon got was the Republican Party, which I've described to you as twice the size of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, was splintered now 3 ways. George Corley Wallace, the governor of Alabama, was leading in 7 or 8 states. And at one point, he was holding 21% of the vote. You had the Bobby Kennedy, George McGovern, Eugene McCarthy wing of the party, anti-war, had all the young people with him. Then you had the Johnson-Humphrey center of the party. And in this battle inside the Nixon camp, we had to find out a way who was going to defense against Wallace to take away votes from him, while Nixon held the center and fought against Hubert Humphrey. And so that went on for a while until I wrote Nixon a memo, which is in my book. I said, for 2 months, sir, we've been 5 points behind Humphrey. In those days, you didn't gain 5 points overnight. That almost told you how it was going to come out. And I said, we're going to have to be bold if we're going to win this thing. And, sir, there's nothing I can think that's bolder than if you put the hero of bedtime for Bonzo on the ticket. And that, of course, was the governor of California, Ronald Reagan. In the Nixon campaign in '68, people don't realize it, there was a tremendous drive and a move to conscript the governor of California, Ronald Reagan, who was immensely popular and who could really contest for the social conservatives and the Northern Catholics. And half of us wanted to put Ronald Reagan on the ticket. Then we got to Miami, and we didn't get Reagan. We didn't get Reagan because the polls, as we arrived in Miami, showed Nixon ahead. So then we said, you don't want to take a risk now because we're ahead. So you take someone who is not the big risk, and Nixon can win it himself. And so that's how Spiro T. Agnew was chosen by Mr. Nixon. And I'll tell you, the press corps, because of that incident in Baltimore where he read the riot act of the civil rights leaders, the press was outraged, enraged. Mike Wallace came up to me cursing. What do you so-and-sos think you're doing? You just lost the election. And Wallace was a friend of ours. He'd travel with us. He wasn't a hostile press fellow. But he just was outraged. And so I go upstairs, and there's nobody up on the 17th floor but Richard Nixon himself. And he says, hey, Pat, come on in. Let's watch Agnew's press conference. So I said, right you are. And so I go in, and he and I are sitting there watching TV, and Agnew's up there being tough as he can be in the press conference. The press is going after him, and Agnew's really holding his own. And I'll never forget what Nixon said to me. He turned to me and said, Buchanan, I think we've got ourselves a hanging judge here. And he turned out to be. So then I had one more experience I want to tell you about. And that is when we got to Mission Bay out here after our own convention where Nixon was nominated, I told Nixon that, I said, it's important, I think, we have eyes and ears at the Democratic convention. So can you send me to Chicago? and I want to observe it, and I'll be your eyes and ears, sir. You and Bibi are going down they go down to Key Biscayne, because in those days, a candidate whose convention was over would get out of the way while the other candidate had his convention. It's a courtesy it's not done anymore. So Nixon went to Key Biscayne, and I went to Chicago, and I stayed I was right there at the Main Center Hotel, which we called the Comrade Hilton on Michigan Avenue. And truth be told, I was gassed there. I went across the street in Grant Park, and I was accused of being an FBI agent by all the radicals. And then when the big night came, I was alone in the 19th floor of the Comrade Hilton, and I heard a commotion down on the street. At the same time, somebody walks in, and it's the novelist Norman Mailer. And he says, "Hi, Pat." And I went, "Well, hello, Norman. What are you doing here?" And he's got a friend with him, Jose Torres, the light heavyweight champion of the world. And the three of us are there having a drink, and he's telling me what a conservative, basically a small C conservative he is. And we hear this noise going down in front of us, and we sat there and witnessed those cops coming down Balboa, going into Grant Park, people down left and right. Norman Mailer has it all in his book on Miami and the convention at Chicago, and he mentions he was on the 19th floor. He does not say who he was looking out the window with. But it was an incredible event, and Hunter Thompson, who later became a friend of mine, he wrote that Richard Nixon's president of the United States because of what happened at Michigan and Balboa that evening. And there's no doubt it's a major contributing factor, but it was unbelievable. I will recall Nixon called me there one time. It was about 2 in the morning. He kept calling me. "What's going on now, Pat?" He's watching this on television down there in Miami Beach or in Key Biscayne with Bibi. And one time I said, "Sir, at 2 o'clock in the morning, you want to know what's going on?" And I opened the window and held the telephone out. And you could hear these obscenities yelled about Richard Daley, which I cannot repeat here. And all these kids were yelling. So I held it out for about 30 seconds. I said, "That's what's going on here, sir." So, it was that. I think that was almost fatal to Hubert Humphrey. In closing, let me just talk about the fall campaign, which, I think is a testament to Hubert Humphrey. He had a hellish time in September. The demonstrators were constantly on his case, dump the hump, and all these things they were saying about him. He couldn't speak. He wasn't allowed to talk, and he was just brokenhearted over it until finally he gave his speech at Salt Lake City saying, basically, "I'll halt the bombing. I will move with the left and get our troops out of Vietnam. We'll bring them all home. Goodbye to the war." And the left came home. And at that time, the George Wallace voters, let me tell you what the polls were on October 4th, 1 month before the election. George Wallace was at 21%, Hubert Humphrey was at 28%, and we were at 43%. 15 points ahead of Humphrey. The election ended 4 or 5 weeks later, 43-all. Hubert Humphrey almost put the boss, the old man as we called him, into the history books alongside Tom Dewey. So big was the Democratic Party, and all those Democrats started coming home, from Wallace to Humphrey and the undecideds to Humphrey. He got them all. And it wasn't until 4 years later and after the White House that we really put together that 49-state new majority. We did have a final, Nixon believes, and he wrote that the final telethon that we had, let me tell you how that worked. We had a telethon 4 hours before the election. We'd get the questions would come in to the Nixonettes and the Nixon girls and the volunteers. They'd write the questions down, and they'd take them into a back room where I was, and where Shelley and Rose Woods and Marge Acker were, and the questions would come in, and they'd give them to me, and I'd say, "Well, we can frame this question a little better." And we'd frame the question, and they would type them up. Then we'd send them out to Bud Wilkinson, and he would pitch the fastballs right down the center for Richard Nixon. And it was produced by someone 28-year-old who had broken his foot in a jump, parachute jump, that 4 hours, and his name was Roger Ailes, who has become fairly well known today. But he was 28 years old that last night. So this is what the whole story and the book are about. And it was an incredible history with an incredible man who, his perseverance, his courage, his ability to get up from defeat, again and again and again is just unbelievable. It really is a testament. I don't care which side of politics you're on, the fact that he came back the way he did. And let me mention, we all know, we were talking at dinner tonight, that people say, what do you remember Nixon for? And the guy say, one, China or Watergate, those two things. But let me just list some of the things he did very quickly in his first term before Watergate. He ended the Vietnam War, brought our troops home, brought all the POWs home. He opened up China to the world and the West. He negotiated the greatest strategic arms agreement since the Washington Naval Treaty of 1921-22. He rescued Israel in the Yom Kippur War. He brought Egypt out of the Soviet bloc into the West. He ended the draft. He gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. He desegregated the South. It was only 10% desegregated when Johnson left office, 70% when Nixon left office. He created OSHA and the Cancer Institute. He named 4 justices to the Supreme Court, including 2 chief justices. The latter one, William Rehnquist, one of the great justices of the 20th century. He then won a 49-state landslide. Unbelievable. Here's the biggest loser of all times, 49-state landslide. And he put together a political coalition that dominated presidential elections for 20 of the next 24 years. Had it not been for Watergate, I think people would be talking about whether he's a near great or a great president. But that's the man I knew as the boss and the old man. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you. Thank you, Pat. Pat's agreed to answer a few questions, which we'll do before the book signing. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll come to you and you can speak into the mic so we'll get it on television. I'm going to start with this young lady from UCLA. Come on over here. And she lives in Anaheim.
You said that President Nixon created the new majority. What do you think the current Republican Party can do to shift the majority back to the right?
I don't, the question is whether a Republican today can replicate what Richard Nixon did in creating the new majority, that 49-state coalition that Reagan recreated in 1984 when he won 49 states and he won 44 against Jimmy Carter. I don't know that you can, because the truth is we are another country right now. We have changed dramatically. Demographically, we're a different country than we were. Today, you can look at 18 states, including 4 of the mega states, California, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, have gone Democratic 6 straight times. Can we get those states back? You've also got a situation where the Great Society and the social welfare state, you must have 100 million or more Americans depend upon government benefits of one kind or another, while half of the country is now exempt from the federal income tax. So how do you get back folks who, when you say we're going to cut government, which means you imperil their benefits, but we're also going to cut taxes, but they don't pay those taxes? So it's a much tougher haul. I think the Republicans can win in 1914, I think they were 2014. Here we are, right back where I was. In 2014, I think they will win the Senate, but 2016 is an uphill run.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul Carter from Whittier, an attorney who produced that great map that shows Richard Nixon's history in Southern California and Orange County, and he's writing a book about Richard Nixon's native son, which will come out next year. I gave you a good plug. Paul.
Thank you very much. Mr. Buchanan, I was wondering if you can give us your thoughts regarding whether President Nixon had a so-called Southern strategy.
Well, clearly, we wanted to Nixon went into all 11 southern states in 1966. He went in and campaigned against George Wallace and against Lester Maddox. And I've described that in my book. If you've read the book, the libel against Richard Nixon is that he used racist tactics to win the South. That is false. The people that did that were the Democrats. Woodrow Wilson resegregated the federal government, carried all 11 southern states. FDR put Cactus Jack Garner of Texas on his ticket, who had imposed a poll tax. FDR put a Klansman on the Supreme Court. FDR put Jimmy Burns of South Carolina on the Supreme Court, who had blocked the anti-lynching law. So for decades, the Democratic Party used the issue of race to maintain the solidity of the Northern Liberal Southern coalition. What happened was Adlai Stevenson. The states Wallace carried are the same states Adlai Stevenson carried against Eisenhower. Was that because Stevenson was a tougher guy in foreign policy than Dwight David Eisenhower? No. Stevenson put on his ticket John Sparkman of Alabama, who was a signer of the Dixie Manifesto, which called for massive resistance to integration and massive resistance to the Supreme Court decision. That's when I was a senior in high school. So the Democrats were, as we wrote in that piece, look at the column I wrote with Nixon and for Nixon, where I said Nixon went south, and he said, look, let's leave it to the Dixiecrats to squeeze the last ounces of political juice out of the rotting fruit of racial injustice. And Nixon had voted was for the Civil Rights Act of 1957, of 1960, of 1964, 65, 68, and he desegregated the South. And once the South was desegregated, once that was off the table, naturally the South moved from its conservative convictions, moved straight into the Republican Party, but only after it was desegregated. So I think, that's a libel, and I'm happy to take that one on, and I've taken it on in that book. The liberals whining and complaining. None of them whined and complained when FDR was winning all Confederate states every single time he ran, all 4 times.
Pat, we are live streaming this program tonight, and we asked our viewers to submit their questions on email, and I'm going to ask one of them from Gary Kim of Denver, Colorado. What are your memories of election night 1968?
Well, they're fairly terrifying. No, there's in Teddy White in his book says, and some of you will know the fellow's name. He said, coming across the country, and when what we did is after we had our telethon that Monday night, we got on the plane and Nixon flew across the country as the country was voting, and my hands broke out in hives, and I've never been able to explain it. I'm sure it was some kind of nerves, but Teddy White writes in his book that on the night of the election, Buchanan and Finch were the most nervous, and Bob Haldeman the most confident. And I think that is right. Let me tell you a story. On Saturday, before the election, I got a call from John Sears, who was one of our political guys, and he said, Pat, tell the old man that Michigan is gone, and we're 3 down in Harris. In other words, the Harris poll had Humphrey at 43 and us at 40. Now, if that were true, the election was over. And so I went into Nixon's suite, and he and Bibi were in front of the television watching the Oregon Ducks play USC, I think. And I explained this to him, and he says, okay, thanks, And I honestly thought we were going to lose the election until returns started coming in, and you saw more and more that Humphrey couldn't win because Wallace was taking all these votes out of the Democratic base, all these states. And Nixon, once we went across the Mississippi, the question was whether we would lose, say, California and have the election thrown into the House of Representatives, where the Democrats were still dominant. So it was that night I was up at the Waldorf Astoria, And I stayed up all night long until about 6 or 7 in the morning, and I went down and got in a room and fell asleep, and I woke up, and they said, Nixon's gone to Key Biscayne. So they left me there, and but I waited until 8 o'clock in the morning until they finally decided Illinois, but we didn't need Illinois.
Thank you, Pat. A business graduate from USC. We had a question from somebody from UCLA, so I'm going to balance it with Mr. McFawn from USC.
Mr. Buchanan, so of all the daily press summaries that went from your office to the president's, what was the most positive news you delivered to Mr. Nixon other than the elections of 68 and 72?
Of all the news summaries, of all the, what was the best news that came into Richard Nixon? Well, there were an awful lot of, I can't even think of any particular one that went into Nixon. But I'll tell you what he did when he wrote back is, let me tell you a story about that brings up. I did briefing books for all of Nixon's press conferences. From the time I got there, I would, I'd figured out a system. Ziegler and I would work on the press and study the issues that were up. And I would write, about 25 or 30 questions and answer them. Nixon wanted the answers reduced to 120 words and everything. And at the end of that, Ziegler and I would get together, Ron, and we'd get together and we'd send a memo called the BZ, Buchanan-Ziegler Memo, predicting what were the most likely. I'd have 25 questions answered in the book, or 30, foreign and domestic, the most likely 15 question we thought he would get. And so Nixon went out, and we did very well with it. It had a good record. So one time I sent him the BZ memo, and I predicted the questions, and I had all the questions in the book, and every single question the press asked on every issue, I had predicted and had an answer in the book. Just 100 on your test, okay? So I get a call after the press conference was over, and Nixon said, the president says, Buchanan, I see you predicted every single question they would ask. And I said, yes, sir, I believe we did. And he said, that's good, but there were some questions in the book they didn't ask. Next time, leave those out. Click.
A question from former State Senator Dick Mountjoy of Monrovia.
Is that Dick Mountjoy over there?
Well, I used to be, until I got older.
How you doing, fella?
Pretty good. Pat, I'm really concerned about the country. And I'm concerned basically about the invasion that we have coming from the South. And my question is this, kind of off subject, but do you know of any other leader of any country that ever plotted, planned, and encouraged the invasion of their own country?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do believe that, look, one of the first responsibilities of any president of the United States is to secure the borders of the individual states of the Union. And I regret to say that Congresses and presidents of both parties for the last 25 years have failed to do that on our southern border. And we have a hellish problem and a long-term peril, I think, to the unity and cohesion of our nation from, an invasion which is now running up to 12 million or more people in the United States. And I think unless we get control of it, we're in peril of losing the country we all grew up in. And this has been an issue, as you know, since I first launched my own political career, which wasn't all that successful. But I'm very apprehensive about that, and I do not understand why that the incumbent president of the United States cannot even go down and take a look at the crisis on the border and is shooting pool when he should be down there. And so that's my view of that. Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Buchanan. My question is a counterfactual history question. If Nixon would have won the election in 1960 rather than JFK, would we have had a Cuban Missile Crisis? Would we have had a Bay of Pigs? And how would he have handled Vietnam? Now, we know from Khrushchev's diaries and what have you that he thought John F. Kennedy was a lightweight. I don't think he would have thought that way about Nixon. How do you see it?
I do believe that Khrushchev saw Kennedy hesitate or launch the Bay of Pigs, which was a complete debacle. Then he ran into Kennedy at Vienna, and even Kennedy himself said that Khrushchev had brutalized him. He then put up the Berlin Wall and got no response except for Kennedy called up a lot of my friends for one more year in the service. And I think that persuaded Khrushchev that he could get away with putting missiles in Cuba. He would never have done that under Eisenhower, and because of World War II and everything. And I don't think he would have done that while if Richard Nixon had won that election at all. And I don't think Richard Nixon would have sent those fellows into Cuba unless he was determined that invasion would work. So I think it would have been a different situation, undoubtedly. But I can't know. With regard to Vietnam, I'll be honest, as I point out in my book, I supported the Vietnam War as an editorial writer from 1962. I supported Kennedy in the missile crisis. And I think that the whole country, at one point when Johnson, maybe it was 65, but Lyndon Johnson had the support of 70% of the country, and the Vietnam War was supported by 80% of the country. So I don't know with regard to Vietnam, but I don't think Khrushchev would have trifled with Richard Nixon the way he did with John F. Kennedy. If you recall also Brezhnev, whom we all met, Brezhnev threatened in the Yom Kippur War. There were Soviet airborne divisions moving toward their bases, their jump-off bases, and there were we were hearing, I don't know if it's true, that Soviet ships were coming through the Dardanelles, and some of them armed with nuclear weapons. And you saw Nixon had an all-out airlift to save Israel in that war. And it was a very tough time because I was in the President's Oval Office just before the so-called Saturday Night Massacre. He was talking about Richardson was coming in. I was in the Oval Office. Richardson was right outside. And Nixon said, there's no way I can be defied by a member of my own cabinet when you get the Russians looking at me and wondering whether I'm going to stand tough in the Middle East. So he had to get rid of Richardson at that time. The ball had started rolling, but I was right there with him, spent 45 minutes that day. And I went out and saw my old friend Elliot walking in to get his head chopped off.
Pat, over here to your right, a professor from Beijing, and he wants to ask a question about the future of U.S.-China relations.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. I'm a professor at Hubei University in China, and I know that you were there from the very beginning of the relationships with China. Mm-hmm. If Nixon were alive today, what do you think he would say about where the future relationship of both China and the U.S. are going?
President Nixon, again, in my book, and again, some of these things I got by going back into my files. I hadn't realized what was in there, hints and suggestions from things I'd wrote to Nixon. Like one of them I got out and it said Nixon he said, run down what Rockefeller has said on China. This is 67, I believe, has said on China, so what, And when we ran it down, he wanted to know if Rockefeller was in favor of recognizing China or moving to engage it. Richard Nixon believed very much that in the United States and the Soviet Union and the United States and China had to manage this relationship, which was going to be troublesome and going to have a lot of rough spots in such a way that we never went to major war against each other. He really believed that and he believed in his own capacity to achieve this. Now, I'm much more of a skeptic than Richard Nixon was. He did believe he could create a generation of peace. And I think China was a very large part of it. How would he manage the relationship now with China and Japan? I think he would be talking seriously and strongly and directly to the Chinese, not to ruin all the benefits that have come out of the relationship as it has grown in the 40-plus years since he went there. And that's all I can say. But he was very proud of the fact that he had opened China up, or that he had gone there to the People's Republic.
Pat, in the middle of the room, our final question from a young man from Laguna Niguel.
Thank you. With what's going on now in the Middle East, and once again, where the United States and the Russians seems to be playing this game of tactics, or whatever you want to call it, you had mentioned before that Egypt was removed from the Eastern Bloc and into the West. Right. Now it seems that that's either going to be slowly going back, and the other Middle Eastern states are going back to Russia. How do you see all that playing out now that, I mean, when you watch these things, what's going through your mind? Because you watch it go the other way. Right.
Well, my view is that my view of the Russians is different than a number of folks. See, I think Putin, there's no question he wants Crimea back. Putin, to me, is responding to what happened when his guy, basically in Kiev, whom he had cut a deal with, to have Ukraine come into his economic union, was dumped over by those crowds in the streets in Kiev that were encouraged by the United States and McCain and all the others. I think he saw that as sort of like a coup d'etat managed by the Americans, which tore it away from him. And then he said, well, they're not going to get my naval base at Sebastopol. I'm not going to a Russian naval base we've had for 200 years and salute NATO soldiers. So he went and got that back. But I don't see him as the big player in the Middle East. I don't see Russia as the big player in the Middle East at all. I think the Middle East, in a way, is going its own way. It looks to me more, you can find out what's going on in the Middle East by studying the 30 Years' War in Europe, the Catholics and the Protestants and the turmoil of religion and states involved, which carried off a third of the population of Germany. And I think that is going of its own, that sort of started off on its own track, the Middle East. But Ukraine, I'm a little apprehensive over, this is a terrible horror that took place with that downing of that aircraft. But it's that downing of that aircraft, I mean, it was not deliberate mass murder, but no doubt those folks are dead. Somebody made a horrendous military blunder and brought that down, and now Putin is on the spot, and many Republicans are calling for weapons to Ukraine. But if you encourage the Ukrainians to go grab back their two provinces militarily and humiliate the Russians, you're probably putting Putin in a point where he's going to have to respond. And if the Ukrainians try to take back Crimea, there's going to be a war, and the Ukrainians are going to lose it. And if we put a lot of weaponry and everything else in there with the Ukrainians, you're going to find the United States and Russia face to face there. So I'm very apprehensive over what's going on in Ukraine. With regard to the Middle East, I just don't think the United States should go back in there with more and more troops. Why, if the Iraqi army will not even fight and defend Mosul, should American troops have to fight and die to retrieve it for them? So, anyhow, that's my view. And I see he's the guy, he's the Ron Ziegler that stops the press conference.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat Buchanan. Let's show our appreciation for a great presentation. Pat. Pat, don't leave before I present you with our great gift. What would Nixon do? Mug? We expect to see you using that on the McLaughlin Group and Fox and other places. Thank you for coming. You and Shelley know this is your home away from home, so please come back. Ladies and gentlemen, Pat will be in the front lobby signing your books, which coincidentally are now on sale in our museum store. For those of you on television, if you would like an autograph book, you can order it via www.nixonfoundation.org. Thank you all for coming. God bless you, and God bless America.